All right, so today we're diving into something pretty thought-provoking, and that is how this ancient philosophy, Stoicism, can actually be applied to some of the modern challenges we're facing with AI, especially when it comes to cybersecurity.
Yeah, absolutely.
And we're going to be looking at this fascinating essay by Jörg-Owe, who really dives deep into this connection.
Right. And what we're going to do in this deep dive is try and give you like a solid grasp on how this guy Schneepat uses these ideas from Stoicism to kind of frame this whole issue, right? Especially in this, super important area of cybersecurity and AI. The goal is to kind of get the core ideas without, drowning in technical jargon.
I think this is so timely, right? Because AI is just becoming so integral to how we protect ourselves online, but it also raises all these ethical dilemmas that we can't ignore.
For sure, for sure.
So maybe we can start with the basics. What are those core Stoic principles that Schneepat is drawing on here?
Well, Schneepat's essay really hones in on Stoicism's emphasis on reason and, this idea of what benefits the community as a whole. And this actually comes from this really interesting Stoic concept of like a universal reason that kind of guides everything, right?
Okay, interesting.
Yeah. So for Schneepat, one of the key takeaways from Stoicism is this idea that virtue, and by that they mean things like wisdom, justice, courage, and self-control, these are the ultimate good. And get this, all those external factors, like even something as powerful as AI, they're considered ethically indifferent.
Indifferent. That's a curious term when we're talking about something as potentially world-changing as AI. What exactly does Schneepat mean by that?
Right. So indifferent doesn't mean insignificant or like we should just ignore it. What he's saying is that AI itself doesn't inherently have a moral value. It's not good or bad in and of itself. He uses this really great analogy. He compares AI to a tool, like a hammer. Right. So a hammer, you can use it to build a house, which is obviously a good thing, or you can use it to, cause harm. It's not the hammer itself that's good or bad. It's how we choose to use it that determines the ethical implications. And that really ties into this whole Stoic idea that what we should really be focusing on is cultivating our own virtues, as we use and interact with these AI tools.
Yeah, that makes the whole indifferent thing a lot clearer. So we've got this idea of virtue as the ultimate good and AI as ethically neutral. How does Schneepat then apply this to the very specific ethical challenges we see in cybersecurity today?
Well, a big part of it is this thing called the dichotomy of control, which is a central concept in Stoicism. Basically, it says we should focus our energy on things we can control, like our own thoughts and actions, and just accept the things we can't. So in the world of AI, Schneepat's arguing that instead of trying to over-regulate the technology itself, we should be focusing on using it responsibly for the benefit of, humanity. It's about steering AI in the right direction, if you will.
So it's more about guiding its development and application than trying to stifle innovation.
Exactly. And then another crucial element Schneepat brings up is this idea of reason, which is huge GE in Stoic ethics. And he applies this to the whole issue of AI transparency in cybersecurity. Stoicism really values that rational, thought process as the key to navigating difficult moral issues. So for Schneepat, this translates to a need for AI systems that are transparent, where we can actually understand how they're making decisions. The goal, he says, is to foster ethical behavior in the people who are actually creating and using AI tools.
That makes a lot of sense, especially in cybersecurity, where trust and understanding are absolutely vital. So Schneepat lays out this whole ethical framework for AI in cybersecurity. What are the main pillars of that framework?
He's got a few key principles he outlines. The first one is transparency and accountability. He argues that AI systems should be able to provide clear explanations for the actions they take. Like, for instance, if an AI system blocks a certain IP address, it should be able to tell you why it did that. You shouldn't just blindly trust these decisions. This really ties back to that Stoic virtue of wisdom, constantly striving for understanding.
So it's not just about AI doing its thing, but about us being able to understand its reasoning. What's next?
The next one is justice through fairness. Schneepat is really adamant that we need to design these AI algorithms in a way that minimizes bias and promotes just outcomes. This obviously reflects the Stoic ideal of justice, right?
Right.
So, we need to be very, very careful about scrutinizing these algorithms for any potential biases, like gender or racial bias, to make sure they're not, skewing our cybersecurity defenses in an unfair way.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we've all seen how biased data can lead to really problematic outcomes. Okay, so we've got transparency, we've got justice. What other principles are crucial here?
Schneepat also talks about this really kind of tricky balance between privacy and security. He says that any ethical framework for AI in cybersecurity has to really carefully navigate this tension.
Right.
Like, yeah, we want to enhance security, but we don't want to do it at the expense of people's privacy unnecessarily.
Right.
And then lastly, he outlines this principle of temperance through constraint. What he means by this is that AI systems need to operate within certain defined boundaries.
Okay.
They shouldn't be overstepping their, intended functions. He uses this example of AI in medicine, right? Like, imagine AI that can offer recommendations to doctors, but it doesn't actually make the final diagnosis. That decision still rests with the human expert. Schneppat argues that this kind of built-in limitation is super important when it comes to deploying AI responsibly.
These are all really practical, and I mean, they make a lot of ethical sense, but how do we actually put these ideas into practice?
So to make this all a bit more concrete, Schneppat gives us some implementation strategies based on these very principles. So starting with autonomy and justice, he emphasizes empowering individuals with control over their own data, which is really important, and actively working to reduce bias in those algorithms, like using fairness-enhancing techniques and stuff like that. And when it comes to transparency and wisdom, the focus really shifts to making sure AI operates in a way that's understandable, that it can actually provide explanations for its decisions. It's kind of like making the why of AI accessible, which again ties back to that whole Stoic emphasis on wisdom.
So more transparency, more user control, less of a black box situation with AI. What about the temperance aspect? How does Schneppat see that playing out in practice?
Well, with constraints and temperance, he really underlines the need for maintaining those clear boundaries for what AI can and can't do. So again, going back to that medical example, medical AI should be there to support doctors, not replace them. He also stresses the importance of setting those clear ethical guidelines and safeguards from the get-go. Think of it as being proactive, like putting measures in place to protect against things like data breaches. And, this is really important. Schneppat emphasizes that because AI is evolving so rapidly, we need to be constantly reflecting on and adapting these ethical frameworks.
Yeah.
What works today might not work tomorrow.
Right. Yeah. A static framework wouldn't be very helpful in a field that's constantly changing.
Now, Schneppat also acknowledges that there are some inherent challenges and limitations to applying this framework to AI, right? What are some of those hurdles? One of the biggest ones he talks about is this potential need for government intervention. Like, what if those voluntary ethical guidelines just aren't enough? From a Stoic viewpoint, you could argue that this type of intervention is actually an application of wisdom and justice, stepping in to protect the common good and prevent potential harm. But as Schneppat also points out, actually implementing these interventions in such a fast-paced field, it's very complex.
Yeah, finding that right balance between encouraging innovation and ensuring it's done responsibly, it's not easy. What other limitations does Schneppat bring up?
He also talks about the inherent difficulty of making sure that complex AI systems consistently make ethical decisions, even when they're guided by those Stoic principles. Those principles are a solid starting point, but actually translating them into the actual code and operations of AI, that's a huge undertaking.
Right.
He does talk about the importance of integrating ethical data practices from the very beginning, but he also acknowledges the real-world challenges of achieving true transparency and accountability across the board.
So even with the best of intentions, it's tough to guarantee that ethical considerations will always be upheld in practice.
Exactly. And then another thing Schneppat touches on is this tension between, how corporations operate, their focus on profits, and those ethical responsibilities inspired by Stoicism.
Yeah.
Like there's this trend of companies trying to redefine their purpose to be about more than just making money, which Schneppat notes, but sometimes aligning those, broader goals with financial reality, that can be a real struggle, and that can definitely hinder the widespread adoption of these ethical frameworks.
Absolutely. The bottom line often seems to trump ethical considerations. And lastly, what does Schneppat say about AI's own limitations when it comes to actually embodying those Stoic principles?
One of the key points he makes is that, AI can process tons of information. It can make decisions based on algorithms, but it doesn't have that emotional intelligence and nuanced ethical reasoning that we as humans have. Stoicism places so much value on that role of reason in ethical behavior, but the reason that AI uses, it's fundamentally different from how we reason, especially when it comes to those really complex ethical judgments. And Schneepat says this raises some really big questions about how much AI can actually embody those Stoic principles in a genuine way.
So it's a powerful tool, but it can't perfectly replicate human ethical understanding. Now, to make this even more concrete, I think Schneepat uses some really interesting case studies in his essay, right?
Oh, yeah. He brings up the analysis of something called Intelligent Decision Support Systems, or IDSS. And what he highlights is this idea that ethical AI should be there to enhance human judgment, not replace it altogether, which fits really well with those Stoic ideas of reasoned action, right? He also talks about those ethical questions surrounding fully autonomous AI. Like, imagine that in a judicial context, which is pretty scary. And he proposes this concept of Stoic AI that actually seeks out human input for those really critical decisions. Schneepat also points to that trend we were talking about earlier, companies moving away from just focusing on profit and incorporating broader societal goals into their missions, which aligns with those Stoic ideals of social responsibility. And then lastly, he brings up some research that highlights the limitations of AI when it comes to making ethical judgments. Again, really highlighting that need to understand the clear differences between how humans and AI approach these complex issues.
Those examples really bring these ideas to life and show us how relevant they are in the real world. So if we were to summarize Schneepat's main message about Stoicism and AI in cybersecurity, what would you say it is?
Well, I think the big takeaway from Schneepat's work is that this framework, this Stoic-inspired ethical framework, is a really valuable and I think timely lens for understanding and addressing all these complicated ethical issues that are cropping up with AI, especially in cybersecurity. By focusing on those core Stoic principles like virtue, reason, and that idea of the common good, it gives us a really solid foundation for developing and deploying these technologies responsibly.
And for you, the listener, tuning in to this deep dive, what should you walk away with from this conversation about Schneepat's work?
What Schneepat's advocating for is a very thoughtful and measured approach to AI. It's about prioritizing that responsible enhancement of what we can do as humans, making sure AI operates transparently, promoting fairness in algorithms, and, respecting data privacy. And at the end of the day, being very cautious and deliberate about how we design and use AI in such a crucial field.
It's about being mindful, right? Not just letting AI run wild, but actually shaping its development and use in ways that benefit us all. And on that note, here's a final thought for you to consider as you go about your day. We've talked a lot about the limitations of AI, that it can't really replicate human ethical reasoning in its entirety. So this is something for you to ponder. What do you think are the most crucial safeguards we need to put in place to make sure AI continues to evolve in a responsible way, not just in cybersecurity, but in all areas of our lives? This is going to become more and more important as AI becomes more integrated into our world. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, everybody.